Hello, my name's Phil Singer. I'm here with Abraham Bolden. It's March 7th, 2020, Saturday afternoon. We're here in Chicago at Abraham's house on South Sangamon in Chicago. Abraham, you've told me a story in the past, and we'd like to record it for history. This is important. Can you tell us about the day you were at the White House and a black limousine pulled up?
Yeah, Phil. This is very sensitive information that I have held back for many years. But while I was the first African American on the White House detail, and this happened in June of 1961, I had been on the detail approximately 2 weeks. I was on the 4 to 12 shift. About 5:30 in the evening, a black limousine pulled up in front of the White House door. Many of the agents who were on my shift had gone to lunch and left about 2 agents to guard the White House. Now, this was the usual practice of the agents on the Secret Service. And that was one of the faults I found out that I didn't like while I was on the detail, is that many times the agents would vacate the White House and then they would go out and have fun, drinking, and they would come back later in a condition which they could not protect the President of the United States. But the agents, thinking that probably the President had gone upstairs to his room, living quarters, had gone out and taken a long lunch. Black limousine pulled up in front of the White House, and President Johnson got out of the back of the limousine. He slammed the door with all his might. He came trumping through the White House. I was sitting in the Secret Service office when he came through. So I followed President Johnson to the Oval Office. I stood outside the Oval Office because I could see that that post was not being covered. There was a lot of yelling and hollering and screaming. Between Bobby Kennedy, I recognized Bobby Kennedy's voice. I recognized Johnson's voice. And Johnson was being very vulgar. I also recognized the President's voice. And there was no question about it. There was a political argument that was going on. There's a lot of cursing being done by President Johnson. And every now and then I could make out a word or two, and they were talking about the coming election. After about 5 minutes in the office, 5 to 10 minutes, Johnson came storming out of the office. Left the office door open, and I looked inside. I saw Robert Kennedy and President Kennedy standing up talking and somewhat smiling at each other. Johnson stumped out of the office, and before he exited the office completely, he turned around and told President Kennedy, "You better stop fucking with me, you son of a bitch. Gonna get enough of fucking with me." And I was shocked because I took that as a threat to the President. It was a subtle threat, but I took it as a threat to the President. So when the leader of my ship, who was too stout at the time, came back from lunch, I mentioned to him that President Johnson had visited the White House. And I told him that there had been an angry conversation between the President and President Johnson. As I recall now, Stu Stout told me not to worry about that. It happens occasionally. Now, Johnson looked around and saw me as I was standing by the door, and he asked some person who was, I guess, the White House personnel, "Who is that Negro standing there. Say, oh, he's a Secret Service agent. And Johnson left. I followed Johnson to the front of the White House door. He got back into the same limousine. And the limousine pulled off. Now, I swear by my mother's grave that this happened. This is the truth to the best of my ability. And if it were possible that I could recall the date, it was in mid-June of 1961, about 5:30 in the afternoon. And that's what I recall to the best of my ability.
Now, Abraham, you chose not to include this in your book, Echo from Dealey Plaza, right?
Yes. Because it was a volatile situation. I didn't want to enter into that type of situation because I had already suffered enough in revealing the fact that there was an assassination attempt in Chicago. And that was being questioned. And I had been severely punished for revealing that. And now, since some files have been released, it has been proven that there actually was an assassination plan to kill the president in Chicago. And also in Miami, Florida.
Now, this is assassination attempt in Chicago would have been at Soldier Field, possibly?
Yes, that's right, on November 2nd, between the Army and Air Force football game. This is when it was supposed to be occurred. Now, I understood that Vietnamese President Diem got assassinated that day before. And there was some talk that that may have been the reason that the president canceled his visit. But in the Secret Service office, we were aware of the fact that the president had planned to attend the football game. We were prepared for his attendance. And when the cancellation came from Washington, D.C., we were told that the president was not coming because of security concerns. There was no mention of DM or assassination or anything.
Now, you mentioned your story about Johnson. You referred to him as president, but he was the vice president.
He was the vice president at the time.
And this would have been in 61.
61.
But you're thinking you overheard they were talking about the upcoming election in 64?
They were talking about who was going to be on the ticket.
Already in 61, they were already talking about this.
Sure, just like now. They've been talking about who's going to be on the ticket.
With Trump.
With Trump.
Whether it's Pence
and
or...
They've been talking about that for over a year now.
Okay.
They've been having debates, and the election is about a year and a half away.
But that's what you sort of overheard, that among other things, they were arguing about the ticket already.
They were arguing about a political situation.
Right, right.
As far as I could determine.
Right. But you definitely heard L.B.J. threaten Kennedy.
Definitely. I wouldn't put that on Johnson if I hadn't heard.
And he says,
and I took it to be a serious threat. And when the president was assassinated, the first thing came into my mind that President Johnson had something to do with it.
And just to refresh everybody's memory, you were in Chicago when Kennedy was killed in Dallas.
Yes, that's right.
Right?
I was in Chicago. I was in Chicago when President Kennedy was killed. As a matter of fact, I had just left Washington, D.C. on the 18th of November, 1963. That's when I was called to Washington, D.C. and offered an assignment where they were going to change my identification and make me an anonymous person.
This was 4 days before Kennedy was killed?
No, that was the 18th. Yes, that was 4 days before Kennedy was killed.
So 4 days before Kennedy was killed in Dallas on Friday, you were in Washington, D.C.
I was in Washington, D.C.
Okay.
Talking to Mr. Conlon, who was the head of the Internal Revenue Division, the Investigative Service. And they wanted to change my name, give me a new name, change my name from Abraham Bolden, give me a criminal record in Chicago, remove my birth certificate from East St. Louis, Illinois, and just make me a new person. I declined that assignment because it wasn't clear to me what they were getting at, why they were doing this. But I understand now that the assignment, I was told at this particular time that it had something to do with the Capitol building, that there was some activity going on in the Capitol building, income tax evasion, money sharking that was going on in the Capitol building. That was the reason for the very cautious assignment, the change of identity and such things as that. That's what I was told.
So that was on Monday the 18th. Kennedy was in Florida at that time.
Yes, that's right.
Then he went to Texas.
Then he went from there. He was supposed to come to Chicago. See, now we're talking about 1963, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
18th.
November 18th?
Yes.
That's when he was in Florida.
18th. Right.
And then 4 days later he was killed in Dallas.
That's right.
Okay.
That's right.
Now in
Now, the
retrospect...
Chicago trip had already been canceled.
Right.
Yes.
November 2nd.
Yes, that's right.
On a Saturday at Soldier Field,
That's right.
football game.
That's right.
But do you feel they were trying to change your identity due to what you knew about the canceled Chicago
Well,
trip?
I was complaining, predicting that the president would be assassinated. I was charging the Secret Service with neglect. I had written memos to the chief of the United States Secret Service, had conversations with him.
You're talking about U.E. Bauman? Or Rowley?
That was Bauman.
Bauman.
Right, and I had conversations with Inspector Kelly, and Inspector Kelly was the one who was in charge of the investigation of the assassination of the president in Dallas, Texas. He was a Secret Service agent who gave me the call on November the 23rd that Oswald had mentioned the name of John Hurd. That came from Inspector Kelly. Now, I had previously complained to Inspector Kelly when he came to Chicago doing a routine conversation or evaluation of the agency. And I had complained to Inspector Kelly about how the Secret Service were going about the duty and their neglect of duty, the drinking. And as a result, there was no disciplinary action taken against the agents who continued that same type of conduct as revealed in the assassination of the president, prior to the president's assassination. And I firmly believe that contributed to the assassination of the president, the conduct of the Secret Service. And in my opinion, agents should have been prosecuted from the neglect of duty.
Now, Abraham, you've told me, and I believe you've written in your book, The Echo from Dealey Plaza, that you personally overheard agents say they would not take a bullet for the president.
And this happened in 1961 in Hyannisport, Massachusetts.
Say what you heard them say.
1961. Well, it was a discussion. Harvey Henderson was the leader of the discussion, and they were talking about President Kennedy in vile terms. They wouldn't call him President Kennedy, they were calling him such terms as SOB. Yeah.
And they would say that in front of you.
They would say, oh yeah.
They would refer to Kennedy as a lover in front of you.
In front of me, yeah.
And they said,
and look at me.
And look at you.
In the eye, right.
And they would say, we're not going to take a bullet for him?
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Were those the words they used?
That's right. He said if an assassination attempt were made, they would not take a bullet for the president. They would take no action. They wouldn't give their life for a president. Because what he was trying to do was marry little black boys with their daughters. Integration. And that would mess up the country. This was the attitude. This was what the discussion.
So it was a racial hatred.
It was a racial hatred thing.
Okay.
No question about it.
You want to tell
Because it was during that conversation that the leader of the conversation, Harvey Henderson, told me to my face. He said, Bolden, I want to tell you something and don't you ever forget it. And this happened on July the 3rd of 1961 in Johannesburg, Massachusetts. You were born here, you're going to die. You'll never be anything else but a so act like one. And Harvey Henderson at that time was acting as the leader of the ship because Stu Stout was on vacation. And
you went to U.E. Bauman
right.
and complained about that.
Yes.
And what did he tell you?
Then this was on July the 5th. I went to U.E. Bauman. U.E. Bauman told me he would look into it and discuss it with James Rowley, who was the chief of the White House detail. Whether he did or not, I don't know. But he took names, took down the information, and said that he would discuss it. But I never got a memo to discuss it any further with anybody. As a matter of fact, when I would bring it up, they would say I was thin-skinned, that I should be able to take things like that just like a water off a duck's back, because things are going to happen. Racial turmoil was all over the United States, so I had to adjust myself to accept such terms as that directed at me. And I didn't agree with that.
And U.E. Bauman was the head of the Secret Service.
Yes, but I didn't know that U.E. Bauman was going to retire. So here I am. I had complained about James Rowley and the White House detail. And U.E. Bauman was going to retire in August. I didn't know that. So when U.E. Bauman retired, that put James Rowley as chief of the United States Secret Service. And I had complained about his directorship and what the agents were doing under his command. So you can see that I wasn't in very good standings with Chief Rowley from the get-go, as the boys said.
Why don't you hold this up and John, maybe you can zoom in on Kennedy and Abraham. Tell us about the photo here and what you remember about this
Well,
day.
the only thing I remember about this photo, I didn't even know this photo existed until I wrote this Stalin, who made the photo. Now, what happened is this: I was in Washington, D.C. This was again in 1961. I saw this crowd standing over and they were snapping pictures, so I walked over. Didn't even know I didn't know I'd got that far in the picture. And so, not being able to find a picture of me with President Kennedy, I wrote Stalin, and knowing that the Secret Service had seized a lot of the plates that had been taken with me and President Kennedy, under the cover that I was an undercover agent and that they'd rather not have any pictures or photos of me because during my undercover activity I would be identified as a Secret Service agent. So I wrote Mr. Stoughton and asked him to look through his negatives to see if he could find a picture. I told him I was his first African American in the White House detail, and he remembered. So okay, I'll go through and see, because they were taking my clips from me. So yeah, I remember that. He says, well, I'll go through, and if I see anything, so I'll let you know.
So when you say take the clips, they took the negatives.
Yeah, they took the negatives.
The Secret Service did.
Yeah, they took the whole
Cecil
black
Stout.
thing from any photographer. Cecil Stout was not the only one.
Okay.
No, we had papers there from the Chicago Defendant, the St. Louis Argus. We had papers there from photographers were there from the major news stations. Any photographer that they saw snap my picture in the vicinity of the president, he would always go and ask a photographer for the plate. And I noticed that. And so this was the only time I imagined that they overlooked one because I wasn't supposed to be there. You see.
So as far as you know, this is the only picture of you and Kennedy together? Is that correct?
Yeah. As far as I know.
That still exists as far as you know?
As far as I know.
Tell us a story about the president. Do you have a good
I
human
had
interest
a
story
wonderful
about President Kennedy?
relationship with the president. I had a wonderful relationship with the president because he was a sincere man. He wanted to bring the country together. He was a man who was familiar with hurt, familiar with grief, familiar with pain.
He had back pain.
Yeah, that's right. He was familiar with it, and he had empathy for people who were being mistreated in America. And he wanted to do something about it. I think that he was the most sincere president so far as integration and so far as racial strife was concerned. He was sincere about doing something about it because from the human angle, not from the political angle, I saw in him a desire for equality for all people.
Now you told me he called you by your name. So Mr. Bolden, how are things in Chicago?
Always.
And just he knew your name.
Always, Mr. Bolden. Always. He would break up from a meeting. If it was Dean Rusk or whoever he was with, he always called me Mr. Bolden. Wherever he saw me.
Tell the Jackie Robinson story.
Yeah, no.
Tell that story.
Salinger. This was almost my first day on the job. When
you said Pierre Salinger, the press secretary.
Yeah, he was the press secretary, president's press secretary. And they had just broken up from a cabinet meeting. And I happened to be standing outside the president's door at that time, the Oval Office door. And Hubert Humphrey and Senator from Arizona, Barry Goldwater, were exiting from the Oval Office door. There were two ways to get out of there. There's a door that led to the big conference room, or you could come out to the Oval Office door. Now, I was standing there when Hubert Humphrey and Barry Goldwater came out, and the president saw me standing there on the outside of the door as I reached in to close the door. He looked up, he said, Mr. Bolden, I see you made it here. I said, yes, sir, Mr. President. I was shocked that number one, he remembered my name, and he remembered the conversation. And he invited me into the office. He said, let me show you around. So the first person he introduced me to was Miss Evelyn Lincoln. Her office was adjoining to his office.
His personal secretary,
His personal
Evelyn
secretary,
Lincoln.
Miss Evelyn Lincoln. We shook hands. She said, "Glad to see you here." And then he introduced me to Mr. Hatcher, Andrew Hatcher, who was the first black assistant press secretary, White House press secretary. We shook hands, and then he introduced me to Pierre Salinger, who was approaching, had a handful of papers, and I think he was smoking a cigar, but anyway, he called Pierre over, says, "Pierre, I'd like to introduce you to somebody." He looked at Pierre and said, "I want you to meet Abraham Bolden. He's the first Negro Secret Service agent assigned to the White House. He's the Jackie Robinson of the Secret Service." And I'm telling you, I never will forget that as long as I live. And he seemed happy about it. He was so happy that I was there. We had an honest connection there. And I really think that the day that I met the president on April 28th of 1961 at McCormick Place here in Chicago, I was standing outside that washroom. I really believe that that was ordained by God. And I think that God put me there to carry on after his assassination and to beat the drum for more investigation, because it changed the face of America. And I think that the connection was made because of a divine person, a divine reason. And that reason was for me to carry on the spirituality that he had and to make a contribution to the American people and to be a voice for the betterment of all society.
Tell us that McCormick Place story. You know, president's coming to town. You're hoping you can be on the main floor or the stage to hear them, and they assign you to the basement washroom.
Yeah.
Take it from there.
That's right.
Take it from
they
there.
assigned me to the basement washroom.
And you're thinking, oh man.
Hiding me. Not only did they assign me to the basement washroom, but I had been assigned prior to that to upstairs, the door where the president was entering into the convention room, the dining room. But then I was replaced by a Chicago policeman and given a reason that I was a new agent and that, as I would get more experience, then my things would change. But I knew the real reason. They were snickering and laughing about my assignments. The other agents were. So on the night of April 28th, the president was running a little late. I was standing outside the washroom where they had assigned me for the McCormick Place. And I heard the commotion upstairs, and I looked up the long steps. I could see now the washroom was located. As you walk in the door, you would turn right, and there were 2 flights of steps that you would come down to the washroom. So I just wanted to get a look at President Kennedy. Never thought that this would happen. But the cameras were flashing. People were taking pictures, and I was on the bottom floor trying to look up the steps to see the president. All of a sudden I see his patent leather shoes. And I'm looking, and here comes the president. First thing he wants to do is use the washroom. He's coming down the steps, followed by every top political personage
Mayor
in
Daley?
Illinois.
Mayor Daley?
Yeah, Mayor Daley. I think it was Senator Douglas. There was all your top politicians. There were George Dunn. They were all following the president. There was the black Congressman Dawson from Southside Chicago. And the president came down the steps and he stopped right in front of me. And I was surprised that he stopped and he sort of looked me in the eye. He was taller than me. The president was, he was a good, looked like 6 feet. I was on about 5'10", something like that. He stopped right in front of me and he asked me, he said, "Are you a Secret Service agent? Are you one of Mayor Daley's finest?" So I'm a Secret Service agent, Mr. President. And he said, one other agent, Dick Jordan, said that his name is Abraham Bolden. He's a new agent here in Chicago. The president said, asked me, he said, "Tell me, Mr. Bolden." He called me that from then on. "Tell me, Mr. Bolden." He says, "Has there ever been a Secret Service agent or a Negro Secret Service agent assigned to the White House detail in Washington, D.C.? Now, he knew the answer. He knew the answer.
He did, huh?
Yeah, he knew the answer. He said, "Not to my knowledge, Mr. President." He said, "Would you like to be the first?" I said, "Yes, sir, Mr. President." He said, "I'll be looking forward to seeing you in Washington soon."
And what do you remember thinking at the time when he asked you that? What do you recall thinking?
I didn't know what to think. It was just so much of a miracle that we were shaking hands with the President of the United States, and he was making a commitment to me, and we just met, that he was going to see that I became the first African American on a White House detail. And the promise came through, even though the Secret Service tried to make light of it and say, "Oh, we were going to do that anyway." No, they weren't. Had that conversation not taken place, it never would have happened.
So you go home that night. You tell your wife, Barbara, what?
Yeah, I was walking on the cloud, man.
Tell her what? Tell us what you said. And she
I
said,
met the president.
"You said I met the president."
Yeah, I said, "I met the president tonight." She said, "You lying?" I said, "We had a conversation." She said, "You lying?"
She said, "You're full of shit."
Yeah, she didn't cuss. She just said, "You
okay.
lying." I said, "Yes, I did." And talking, he told me he was going to put me on the White House detail, invited me to become on the White House detail. She said, "Well, you tell him?" I said, "I told him, yeah." And we went on after that, after the conversation, we went for a while. And after a week or two, we thought that, April, then we got May, nothing was happening. And I started to kind of lose confidence, maybe something like that. Then I got the memo to report to the White House on June the 6th. To report to the White House. And I got my flight ticket to Washington, D.C. And on June the 6th at night, 1961, I walked up that long walkway, past the guard, walked into history. First African American to be assigned to the White House. And I appreciate it very much, and it made my life a lot better, even though I suffered for some things. But in suffering, I learned. Suffering is the best teacher that you can have. I'm deeply dedicated to President Kennedy for putting me in a position to learn and to be of some aid to my fellow man.
In the spring of '64, Kennedy was now dead, you were in Washington, D.C. in a phone booth. Is that correct?
In 64.
Spring of 64, you were in Washington, and you were attempting to make a phone call?
To the Warren Commission.
To J. Lee Rankin.
Right.
You want to tell that story?
Well, I think that the people should really read the Echo from D. Faster to get any more information. I think that we've gone into quite a few things that we hadn't intended to go through on camera at this time.
Okay.
And I've had so many interviews, and it's a very emotional time for me to talk about these things. You know.
Sure. Okay. Anything else you want to add?
No, it's just that I have dedicated and concentrated my life to the betterment of mankind. I'm going to do everything until the day that I die to bring peace, love, and happiness into the world. That's my goal now, and that's my only goal. To give myself willingly to the spiritual and to the celestial things in life. That's all I have to say.